Yo, stop that, DJ. All right, man. Welcome to the first lecture of the year 2021. We made it through 2020, y'all. What a tough year that was. We lost a lot of good people. May they rest in eternal peace. But we're glad to be here, man. In case you're wondering what that song was, so for those of you who are hip hop fans, or maybe even just pop fans, may recognize the first few notes of it from Jay-Z's Big Pimpin', right? One of his more popular songs from the late 90s, I believe. But the song itself is actually that sample, sampled by Timbaland for that song, is taken from 1950s, I believe, 1950s and 1960s Egyptian song known as Kosara, and the artist who did that song was Abdel Halem Hafez. So what's the relevance of that? First of all, it sounds very festive, and I figured it's a great way to start the new year. But also importantly, today we'll be talking to some length about Egypt, right? Ancient Egypt to be specific. Now, if I had done this channel in chronological order, this would probably be the first video I should have done. I didn't do it in chronological order just because different lectures were needed in different spaces and I wanted to get them there. But this would have been the first one. So today we are looking at late prehistory, if you will, beginning with the period just before ancient Egypt, and then we talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of ancient Egypt, okay? So I figured that would be a great song to start with it. Granted, the people of Egypt now are a far cry from the people of Egypt of, 3,000 or 4,000 or 8,000 years ago. But in any case, it's the same geographical territory. And like I said, I just like the song. So this is part of our Intro to African History series, okay? Within this channel, I have a couple of different series that I run, but this is part of the Intro to African History series. So there are other people who studied this extensively, archaeologists, historians, Egyptologists, right? So judge the depth of this discussion on that level that it's an intro to African history, rigor, if you will. And I will put other sources in the description box if you are interested in reading this more, which I suspect that you might be. But without further ado, let me go ahead and get started by sharing my screen here. Okay. Jaringana. Okay. I will see you guys at the end as we do. Let's go. So before we talk about this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this part of things because there is an area that I'm only sort of marginally interested in. But when we look at Homo sapiens, which is the human family to which we belong to, the earliest dated migrations probably date back to 100,000 BCE. Okay. And let me take it back a little bit then and explain what I'm talking about when I say BCE. A lot of you guys already know this, but in case you don't, or as a reminder. So for a long time, the way our calendars, at least in the Western and much of the world goes, have used the BC and AD timescale, right? So BC being before, meaning before Christ. So dating back to 0 BC would have been 2021 years ago, okay? Then going backwards each year, it would accumulate. So 2 years before then would have been 2 BC, right before Christ. And of course, the year after that would be the next period, which brings us to 2021, is known as AD, which does not mean after death of Christ, because that would leave at least like a 30-year period unaccounted for between BC and AD. It means Anno Domini, which means the year of the Lord, or the year that Christ was born. So then that goes on from 2021 years ago up until now. That's the AD era. Now, of course, that's a very Christian-centric time scale, and a lot of people have been moving away from that. And as such, other terms that are used in place of that, in place of BC, people will say BCE, which means before the Common Era, right? Then CE instead of AD, but the time scales are the same. So you know, every now and then I might slip into say BC or BCE or CE instead of AD. Just know that I'm talking about the same period of time. Now back to the work at hand. So about 100,000, you know, BC, folks start to migrate across Africa, with Northern Africa, that area, the northern part of Africa, being the cradle of humanity. People start to move across Africa, and then some even move into Western Asia, parts we call the Middle East today. However, the first major migration was 60,000, I mean, outside of Africa, was 60,000 years ago, when a lot of people moved from the continent into Asia and Europe. Then there's debates around when folks started to move to eventually made it to the Americas. But some dates have it at 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. The recent findings I came across were talking about taking that further, even to 20,000 and 30,000 years ago. Those are the migrations. Okay, so now between 16,000 BC and 11,000 BC, there is a climatic catastrophe which became known as the dry phase, you know, across Africa. Just hot, dry, inhospitable. And this facilitated a lot of some of the movement within Africa, right? In fact, the last video I did was on the 4 major language families. And a lot of the major language families actually split across the continent at around this time, as people sought other places to reside that were a little bit more hospitable. This came to an end around 12,000, 11,000 BCE, and began what was known as the wet phase, right? 11,000 BCE to 6,000 BCE. So there was this wet phase in Africa, or the wet African phase, not to be confused with the WAP that you guys know today. This was the wet African phase. And what that meant was, again, across the continent, you know, the environment was lush, the animals were well fed, crops were, plants were growing, you know, the rivers were full and so forth. So this marked the beginning of the agricultural revolution, what we call the agricultural revolution. And farming begins that same year, I mean, in 10,000, you know, begins around 10,000 BC with, as people began to harvest wild grain that was growing, right? So wild grain was growing. So up until now, people have been eating fruits and things on the go. You know, hunting has already been a thing. But the idea of farming, people start to find wild grain growing and starting to harvest it, okay? And the more they do this, the more that they observe the patterns and decide to domesticate it. So beginning 7,000 BCE, you see crops such as millet and sorghum. These are grains. These are in the grass family. Sorghum, which is pictured here, and they they get domesticated. And the groups that domesticated them are mainly the Afro-Asiatic communities and the Nilo-Saharan communities. Again, if you watch the video I did on the language families, you know these groups. But Afro-Asiatic, really, much of the denizens of Northern Africa, and Nilo-Saharans, North and Northeastern, and you know, down to a little bit of Central Eastern Africa, start to domesticate these, right? Now, the moment you start to domesticate crops, right, or the moment you start to get into farming, right, we're talking about the birth of farming as a culture here. It leads to bigger sedentary communities. Why is that? Well, the idea of farming, right, it presupposes you claiming a few things. One, claiming land as your own, right? This is our land. This is where we get to do our farming. Whereas if you're hunting or if you're nomadic and doing all these things, You can travel from place to place and catch what you catch and so forth. But the idea of saying like, okay, this is the place where we farm. This belongs to us, right? Becomes important. And if you're going to do that, then you need to sort of have that set up, and that is to be more sedentary. Secondly, unlike hunting or roving groups of gatherers, right? Farming requires a level of hierarchy. How do you defend your land, right? Who decides whether somebody's contributions to this farm or to this project have been enough? How do we get more land when needs be? Okay, and furthermore, as people are more sedentary, as you guys very well know, I assume you guys live in mostly sedentary societies. There are certain needs that develop, right? Certain needs that develop as a community starts to develop, and that lends itself to the creation of hierarchies. We need somebody to be in charge of this. We need somebody to organize how we go about this. So this is, I would argue, around the time that concepts of kingship and so forth develop. Okay, concepts of kingship and so forth develop. Think about that, right? So if you're a more successful farmer than your neighboring farmer, you can buy more things. You have more people working for you, possibly. You can even build a bigger house and so forth, right? So this is when societal hierarchies begin. And so we see these early concepts of kingship developing there. While farming was developing, beginning, like I said, at around the same time during the wet phase, pastoralism, right, which is the idea of herding cattle mainly, but also other animals, was beginning to develop as well. So it starts around 8,000 BCE, really peaks in between 4,000 BCE and 2,500 BCE. And some of the people became very proficient at this. The Nilo-Saharan communities, right, which as well as some Afro-Asiatic peoples, and that's very interesting to see because to this day, groups that are of Nilo-Saharan stock, right, to this day, when you look at the Nilotic peoples of the Sudan, some in Uganda and places like that, to this day, their relationship with cattle herding is still very much sacrosanct, right? It's still very much definitive of who they are. So that is pretty interesting. Then the Southern Kushite people, right, sort of South Sudan, that area, begin to specialize in cow herding, and eventually, due to trade and intermingling, the pastoralism argued to have picked up. I mean, the Khoisan people, who we also spoke about in the last video, are said to have picked up pastoralism as a culture for the Kushite people. This is around 500 BC, so we're getting close to the Common Era by this point. However, the Khoisan people never got into cultivation. To this day, they remain pretty nomadic, pretty much focused on pastoralism, then hunting and gathering as well as a community. So this just sort of sets up the pace for some of the communities that came prior to the development of kingdoms and ancient Egypt, right? Or at least some of the things that were happening at the same time that ancient Egypt was being born. So we spoke a little bit about the Afro-Asiatic community and the Nilo-Saharan, okay? On the Niger-Congo, in the Niger-Congo community, which is mainly in West Africa at this point, what we find is they're also getting into farming, right? They'd also, during the wet phase, they've got into farming, with the women famously planting yams, which became definitive of West African cuisine to this day, such that it's even translated into being a prominent cuisine in the diaspora in Black America and the islands, as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, which centered largely on kidnapping people from West Africa. But other thing that are also fascinating was the development of a solid fishing culture in West Africa, as showcased by this canoe here. As showcased by this canoe here, which is known as the Dafuna canoe, right? Discovered by Fulani herdsmen in 1987 in Nigeria. I believe it is the second oldest canoe known to men. Okay, and the oldest in Africa for sure, but I think it might be the second oldest known to in recorded history. And it was used for different things like transport and trade as well, but mainly fishing. Then also one of the pretty remarkable things, and those who know the Guinea fowl will know how much of a triumph this was, that the West African people of the Niger-Congo stock are said to have domesticated Guinea fowls as early as 2000 BCE. Now that's a crazy animal, crazy bird to domesticate, right? But they did. Then eventually we start to see, remember in the last video when I spoke about how the Niger-Congo language group has two prominent groups, right? The Niger-Congo A and the Niger-Congo B. The Niger-Congo B, which is in most parts synonymous with the Bantu stock. So the Bantu people begin to migrate from northwestern Africa towards Central Africa, all the way to East and Southern Africa. They begin to migrate in 2000 to 2500 BCE. Okay. Okay. So that's a little bit about that. Now, I think we moving on to talking about ancient Egypt now, right? Which is what y'all came here for, right? So as the wet phase is running rampant, okay, and has really invigorated this culture of farming and pastoralism and community and social hierarchies. The Nile River, right, the biggest river in Africa, one of the biggest in the world, actually, as you can see in this map, it's running here from the Mediterranean Sea, right from the northernmost point of Africa. Well, actually, it runs the other way. It runs from south to north. A little anomaly there. But in any case, this is it here, all the way. The end of it is not even in the screen here, but it goes all the way through all the cataracts, through Sudan, all the way through Egypt, right up until we are on the verge of Palestine and so forth. So as these groups that were previously nomadic attempt to settle down, what's the best place for them to settle down? Well, it's the place where there is a lot of water, right, which is what's essential for their farming and pastoral purposes. And the good thing about it is when it floods, right, then you have a lot of water for your crops and for your animals. But even then, when it subsides and the silt that it deposits makes the banks of the Nile fertile for farming. So people really like to gather around that then. So there's a population boom in that area between 5,000 and 4,000 BCE, which leads to, as you can expect, when populations all come and cramp into this place, there's of course resource competition. And what does resource competition lead to? It leads to conflict. What does conflict lead to? Well, it leads to alliances. It leads to, again, to a development of communities, right? 100 of us land on a place. And for as long as we're each gunning at each other, said nobody knows who's safe. You're of what survivor, you know this. But you create alliances, right? Like, okay, if the 5 of us band together, we can survive individual attacks a little bit better. Then maybe we can split the process. Yeah, but what about if 10 of us get together and so forth? So this is how communities grow. And out of that conflict, we see the growth of 3 political alliances that grow into what we call proto-states, early versions of states. And these are Jenny, and Nubut, and Neken. Those are the 3 that developed around 4000. And the earliest known kingships we know grew out of this tradition. And how do we know this? We know this by way of hieroglyphics that sort of depict the leaders of these proto-states in a sort of kingly era. And as well as their burials, archaeologists have been able to find their tombs from this era, and they are, they do represent some royalty. Now, these three proto-states were unified under King Nama, right, who's also known as Aha or Menes, around 3100 BCE, right? So this is the time when ancient Egypt becomes united, right? This is the time that ancient Egypt becomes united. So we've seen here how it grows after the population boom of 5,000, and almost 2,000 later, it is finally united as what we call ancient Egypt today, or as they would call it back then, Kemet. But we'll talk about that shortly, right? I'll make sure to account for that name change before we are done today. Okay. So let's talk about the Old Kingdom. So the kingdoms of Egypt are divided mainly into three groups, into three time periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And we'll talk about that. But before the New Kingdom started, it was there was a short period which was known as early dynastic Egypt, right? So the first 400 years, the first like you see here, when we look, if you're looking at the screen, we say here the three dynasties that define the Old Kingdom are the third to the sixth dynasty. But we said that the kingdom had been unified in 3100. So what is that 500 year period where the second and the first dynasty exist? That is what we talk about when we talk about the early dynastic kingdom. And I'd forgotten to mention this earlier, by the way, that the proto-states were able to grow. Remember the three proto-states we were talking about before they were united? They were able to grow by way of trade, right? They were trading gold, ebony, and ivory. Who were they trading with? With Nubia. They would trade with Nubia, which is the civilization to the south of ancient Egypt, right? And Nubia will come up time and again during this presentation. So, get familiar with that term. It's located around where South Sudan and the likes are today. And then they'll also trade out as far out as Western Asia. But back to the Old Kingdom. So the first two kingdoms are known as the early dynastic Egypt, but the Old Kingdom begins in the third dynasty with the king Djoser, spelled DJ or SER. And it is within this time that so many things that are synonymous with ancient Egypt grew. First of all, the kings were defined as gods, not like we're seen as gods or they were gods, right? Revered in the same way that even the way they were buried was drastically different. This is actually the age that birthed the pyramids, and we'll talk shortly about that. But the kings were seen as gods, and we know this through the hieroglyphic text and through the paintings and through their burial rituals, such as represented by the pyramids. The local government of the Old Kingdom was divided into 42 what they called nomes, which are essentially provinces, sort of like states, right? And the nomarchs, the leaders of each of the provinces, the governors, were answerable to the king. And like I said, from early on, this territory was known as Kemet, and we'll talk about that again. I have a whole section dedicated to that. So it doesn't become called Egypt until, or early versions of the name Egypt don't come into play until much later, until thousands of years later, just before the Common Era, and we'll talk about that. So pictured in this image is a name you may have heard, and this his name is Imhotep, right? Who is just a super genius, just one of these generational geniuses. So this is how he's been described. A vizier, sage, architect, astrologer, and chief minister to Djoser, the founding king of the Old Kingdom. who Joseph, by the way, is also worshipped as the god of medicine in Egypt and Greece. Where in Egypt is identified as Asclepius, which is the Greek god of medicine. Imhotep is considered to have been the architect of the step pyramid built in the necropolis of Saqqara in the city of Memphis. So basically, there are no, when you look at old-timey intellectuals, and even to this day, they don't get much greater than Imhotep, and that is who is pictured here. If I come across an Egyptologist, I would love to have a whole video done just on the biography of Imhotep, because I think it is very fascinating. So that's a little bit about the Old Kingdom. Like I said, it is also known as the Pyramid Age. Okay, it is also known as the Pyramid Age. So Joseph, who we spoke about, was the first king of the third dynasty. Would go on to commission the first pyramid, right? The first pyramid was commissioned by Joseph. Also, during this pyramid age, Egyptian astronomers developed the first 12-month 365-day calendar, right? So this is a prototype of the calendar that we use to this day. Khufu, who's the second king of the fourth dynasty, would go on to build the Pyramid of Giza, which is by far the most famous pyramid in the world. It's the biggest. 2.3 million blocks of limestone, each block weighing at least a ton. No fewer than 4,000 men on site at a time, and it took them 20 years to build. The mathematicians among you, can you please do the man hours that went into that? I'd be interested. It's incredible. It's such an incredible testament to human willpower and strength, right? Then, in fact, it was the tallest building for a long time. For thousands of years after that, it was only surpassed in height in 1889 by the Eiffel Tower. Okay, by the Eiffel Tower, 1889. After that, it's been surpassed a couple times over, of course. But you imagine lasting from say 2500 to almost 4,000 years later as the tallest building in the world. And of course, the Eiffel Tower is not the grand structure that the pyramids are, with all due respect. But in any case, his sons, Khufu's sons, would also go on to build even more pyramids, with his son Jedefra building his at Memphis, which in ancient Egypt, Memphis was the capital of Egypt. Then Khafra built his own pyramid on slightly higher ground, so that it looked bigger than his brothers. I mean, everybody's trying to have this look bigger than their brothers. We're talking about pyramids here, guys. Then of course, Khafra also built the Sphinx, right? Another famous monument in ancient Egypt, the Sphinx. I should have put a picture of the Sphinx here for reference sake. So that's a little bit about the Old Kingdom, also known as the Pyramid Age. So what happened to the Old Kingdom for all its glory? It lasted about 1,000 years. Oh, actually, there are the pyramids, we're talking about right now. Those of the suns. Then I believe that's the one that's the Pyramid of Giza. Then of course that's the Sphinx. So the kingdom lasted 1,000 years. Then what happened? Well, some of the things that happened are things that you will find recurrent in the decline of empires. First of all, the wet season vibes, the wet phase vibes that had allowed the community to grow so much so quickly, we're falling away in those persistent droughts and famines towards the end of the Old Kingdom. Because, like I explained earlier, that the nomarchs, right, the provinces had relative power to do their own trade between themselves and with other groups, and as long as they paid the tax to the kings, many of them got very powerful, right? Many of the nomarchs got pretty powerful and started to assert their power more and more. And as they did so, the king's power waned, right? They stopped paying taxes, and as they sought for more power, they started fighting among each other as well. And especially when there's droughts and the famines, right? People depending more on local enterprise. You know, people are working harder to feed themselves. So they're like, "Yo, why do we keep paying all these taxes? And why do we keep paying allegiance to the king when we are here doing our thing?" So that really led to the collapse of the unified kingdom. And actually, to show that things had gone so far south, the pyramids that had been consistently built for the past 1,000 years were, you know, they stopped being built for 100 years. And in fact, the Nubians to the south, where large sections of Nubia, right, had been captured by the kingdom, were able to attack the old kingdom on its deathbed and reclaim much of their territory as well. So this marked the end of the old kingdom. Let's talk a little bit about the working conditions, because one thing that we hear a lot about is how brutal it was to work, and the pyramids were built by slaves and so forth. And scholars have found that for the most part, this may not be true, right? And here's a little bit of insight I've been able to find on this. The ancient construction workers in ancient Egypt were a mix of skilled artisans and temporary hands, and some appear to have taken great pride in their craft. Some have found graffiti, humorous graffiti on the pyramids, which includes things like we're the drunkards of Menkaure or the friends of Khufu, just like different groups calling themselves different names as they were building. Actually, the idea that slaves built the pyramids was first brought up by Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC. So this is thousands of years after the pyramids had been built, right? But most historians now dismiss it as myth. While the ancient Egyptians, of course, kept some slaves, they appear to have mostly used them as field hands and domestic servants. And, the most famous example came in 12th century BCE, which is in the New Kingdom, which we'll talk about a little bit later, when laborers engaged in, when they were not paid, they would get paid in grain, right? But when they were not paid, they organized one of the first recorded strikes in history. The protest took the form of a sit-in. The workers simply entered nearby mortuary temples and refused to leave until their grievances were heard. Their gamble worked, and the laborers were eventually given their overdue rations of grain. So the idea of the pyramids being built exclusively by slaves or prominently by slaves has been challenged by many historians, who actually say that people were getting paid to work here, and a lot of them took great pride in doing this work. Then, of course, another narrative that comes up prominently is this idea of the pyramids having been built by aliens. I figured I'll share this meme sort of and that is something that the History Channel has devolved into the farce that it has become in recent years. This is where some of these narratives have been coming from. It is just ridiculous, right? And a lot of it really rests on racist narratives that try to deny African people of any agency in doing well, right? Any agency in the amazing, right? It's really based in that sort of narrative. You've seen this not just with Egypt, we've seen this with the Great Zimbabwe. We've seen it even in recent times with how folks talk about how Africa has been able to withstand the worst part of COVID, and they try to come up with all kinds of crazy theories, right? But there's a lot of things that we have going for us as Africans that and I've done a whole video on that COVID thing. So, I'll share that link as well in the description. But I just thought this was a humorous insight into into some of these conversations. So a little bit about the Old Kingdom here. Let's talk about the Middle Kingdom. Remember, the Old Kingdom falls apart, right? And for 100 years, there are no pyramids being built. the Nubians recaptured their territory. Okay, so King Mentuhotep II is able to reunify Egypt in at the turn of the second millennia BC, coming into the 1000 BCs, right? Reconquered the provinces that had rebelled, and you see that the return of divine kingship, right, where the kings are the gods once again. Um, he, and in time, his successors will reconquer the territories of Nubia. They reconnect with in trade with Western Asia, which again is around the area of Palestine and parts of what we call the Middle East today. They are trading with that. One of the things that define the Middle Kingdom is it is an era of great craftsmanship, right? This is when the artistry of the hieroglyphics took a whole different level. And they were the hieroglyphics were no longer just for the elite. Back in the day, it was just like if you were elite, you could read and write, so to speak, which is a dynamic you've seen in other communities as well. But now everybody was starting to do hieroglyphics. And it just got way more nuanced. So, for example, when you're looking at this graphic on the slide, you can tell that it's very beautiful, artistic, different colors, different hues of people, and so forth, right? In fact, I think this one might actually evoke, after the Nubians have been reconquered, I think this image, you can see that some of the folks here are darker skinned than others, as a form of the Nubians who have been reconquered, sort of paying tribute to Mentuhotep's successors, or whoever the kings of the day was. In addition to making hieroglyphics available for the non-elites, you also see afterlife provisions for local leaders. In the past, only kings would get these pyramids, or royal family would get these pyramids and other afterlife provisions. But now you're starting to see other local leaders get the same sort of treatment. So they would last for a long time as well, and eventually collapse, largely due to an invasion by the people we call the East Coast people, of who came from Western Asia. Now the East Coast people, there's some debates on who they were, but a lot of scholarship has them coming from north of Palestine, or what we call modern day Israel, as the area there. So, and we'll tie this into some biblical stories as we get into the next slide. But just think about that. And they ruled the space for more than a century. And one of the things that why they were able to capture the Middle Kingdom with some ease is that even though the Middle Kingdom was getting more sophisticated, they still did not have a standing army. So when you don't have a standing army, oftentimes it makes your conquering to be pretty easy. So indeed, it's a little bit about the Middle Kingdom here. And while we're here, let me touch on that topic around the ancient name of Egypt. So ancient Egypt, what we call ancient Egypt today would not have been called Egypt at the time, right? It was called Kemet. And Kemet means black land. Some Afrocentric scholars try to, will argue that means the land of black people. But actually, the largely agreed upon assertion is that it means black land, as in the soil of it was dark. And the reason why I go with that one is because the other part of it is known as Deshret, which is where we get the word desert from, which means red land. So sort of because those go side by side, with part of it in the fertile Nile River basin, right? Is known as Kemet, while that of the desert side is known as Deshret. The fact that those names are referred to the two territories make me feel like the soil is the differentiating factor between the two, because the dark-skinned people would have lived on either side of that, right? So that's where the word Kemet came from. So when you talk about Kemetic scholarship, when you're studying Egyptology or in this stuff from back in the day, you'll hear the term Kemet. Just know that we're talking about this area we call modern day Egypt, even though it expands, as you can see in the map, often would expand way down into Nubia. way into Western Asia as well sometimes. Okay. Other names for the territory that came later was Tamari, which means the beloved land, or Mizr, which means just the land. And actually, for many Egyptians in Egypt, they refer to the country as Misr. The name Egypt comes in much later during the New Kingdom, as I've stated, and it comes from the Greek word which is Aegyptos. Aegyptos is a sort of a Greekified version of the term Hot Kapta, which means the mansion of the spirit of Ptah. So, and this was the name of Memphis, right? So, in fact, the country became known after Memphis. So, Memphis was the capital. Remember I said that? And in Memphis, there was a huge house or temple for the god Ptah. So, Memphis was known as that house was known as the mansion of the spirit of Ptah, or house of Ptah, Kapta. And when it got back to Greek, and it became Aegyptos. You can tell that it kind of sounds similar, Aegyptos. So that's where eventually the name was anglified and became Egypt, and it's been Egypt since then. Interestingly, when you think about the Coptic Church, the Coptic Church, we talk about the Christians in Egypt, one known as the Coptics. And you might even find them in Ethiopia and other places like that. We talk about the Coptic Church. The Coptic Church, the word Coptic, also comes from the same term as Egypt. That's where that Ptah sound comes from. So you say when you say Hot Kapta or Aegyptos. So even though the Coptic is essentially a Christian church, right? It would have nothing to do with the House of Ptah as far as its doctrine goes. But it actually derives its name from the same thing. So just a little tidbit there before we go into the New Kingdom. So after the East Coast took over and they ruled for 100 years or so, Egypt rebounded and became a major world power, right? Became a major world power. And one of the things that they did immediately was establish a standing army, right? They established a standing army to make sure that the East Coast things don't happen again. And the empire really grew, spread to Palestine and Syria and south into Nubia. It is that map we were just looking at earlier. Let's go back to it here, right? This is Palestine and places like that, and all the way down into Nubia. So it grows again, right? It really expands. And in fact, a lot of the things that we know, that except for the pyramids and the Sphinx, a lot of the things that we know when we think about ancient Egypt today come from the New Kingdom. So when you look at people like Nefertiti, Ramses, right? King Ramses, Nefertiti, you are looking at all kings from the New Kingdom. Even the title of Pharaoh, right? Like prior to this, the kings were not called Pharaoh. So when you're talking about pharaohs, you're talking about the kings of the New Kingdom. Okay. So a lot of the things that we identify most easily with Egypt come from the New Kingdom. They also built this Karnak temple, which I believe to this day remains the biggest religious building in the world, the Karnak temple. Then you have one of the fascinating things was also like they even had, well, of course they had queens, right? That's where we get people like Nefertiti. But you also had female kings who, say, a brother who was king died or something, and the sister filled in. She would not fill in as a queen, she would fill in as a king. So one of the kings we had who was famous was Hatshepsut, whose statue is here. King Hatshepsut, female king, who was known for establishing trade down the Red Sea to the land of Punt. I think the land of Punt is, I think it's modern day Ethiopia. There's debates too about where exactly is the land of Punt to this day. But again, she was a very influential king as a female king. So these are some of the great things that came out of the New Kingdom, with these different folks reigning and so forth. But since we're talking about both Queen Nefertiti and King Hatshepsut was a female queen, let's look a little bit at women's rights in ancient Egypt. This is something that people don't talk about a lot, right? And people just assume that in such an old-timey patriarchal society based on labor and so forth, the women were probably treated like like lesser beings, right? And after all, this was 3,000 years ago. While they may have been publicly and socially viewed as inferior to men, Egyptian women actually enjoyed a great deal of legal and financial independence. They could, among other things, buy and sell property, serve on juries, make wills, and even enter into legal contracts. Egyptian women did not typically work outside their home, but those who did usually received equal pay for doing the same jobs as men. Unlike women in ancient Greece, for example, who were effectively owned by their husbands, Egyptian women also had the right to divorce and remarry. Egyptian couples were even known to negotiate an ancient prenuptial agreement. These contracts listed all the property and wealth the woman had brought into the marriage and guaranteed that she would be compensated for it in the event of a divorce. That's crazy. Just to think about that. These are things that communities today are still struggling with. Even some of the more liberal communities to this day have struggled with that. And once we go down the pecking order, we'll find that a lot of people, women still can't even say buy and sell property in some places, and so forth. And the idea of a prenuptial agreement is still in so many places, right? So talk about the blueprint. This is 3,000 years ago, guys, and the women's rights already look like this. So that is pretty fascinating to me. So let's talk about the end of the New Kingdom. What brought the New Kingdom to an end? So the late period, the empire was severely weakened after 1100 BC. Okay. Then the groups the countries that they'd conquered, the territories they'd conquered, such as the Palestinians and the Nubians, broke free. Had broken free from the empire prior to that. The Nubians asserted their own independence. Then after that, they were also attacked again by the groups that had broken away, such as the Nubians. The Assyrians and the Persians began to attack. Actually, interestingly, there's talk about, you guys may know the biblical story of the Israelites fleeing from Egypt, and some say this Palestine breaking free from that rule, actually points to that event. Because remember, they keep calling that king the Pharaoh, and of course the Pharaoh is a product of the New Kingdom, so it couldn't have been much earlier. And remember, we said how the Hyksos had conquered Egypt, and now they were fleeing, and they were now breaking away from the rule of the Egyptians, right? So some people have suggested that that's where that story finds its roots in. Then after that, after those, as we went into the last millennium BC, power goes back and forth between different groups. And one of the more famous one was the Nubian kings of Kush, who were part of the 25th dynasty, which is also known as the Black Dynasty, right? Because these people are, again, from Sudan, from the Sudan territory, which is, if you guys know the Nilotic people, very dark-skinned, so that they would have ruled over Egypt, for this 70-year period, during what is known as the 25th dynasty, or the Black Dynasty. Is pretty remarkable. Then they were eventually driven out by another group that was attacking out of Asia, known as the Assyrians, and so forth and so forth. And the powers would go back and forth. Every now and then the Egyptians would reassert themselves, but they finally fell to the Greeks in 332 BC. The Greeks at that point were expanding under the leadership of Alexander of Macedon, who is commonly known as Alexander the Great, okay, and was governed by General Ptolemy. And the Ptolemy gives the name to the dynasty. It was known as the Ptolemaic dynasty. And and that dynasty reigned until 30 BCE, so just before the Common Era, with Cleopatra being the last one to reign in that bloodline. Now, Cleopatra is very fascinating to me because I've put here this image of her because I figure that's an approximation of what I imagine she would look like. The reason Cleopatra is so fascinating is because she's often this, and right now this is happening because I think there's a Cleopatra movie coming out with Gal Gadot of Wonder Woman fame supposed to be playing Cleopatra, and she is often the subject of conversations about whitewashing by Hollywood and other Eurocentric media. What do I mean by that? Well, as you well know, that historically things of things of Africa, of Black people, have been scrubbed out with agency being given to whitewashed versions of them, right? You see this all the time. I won't even start going through the examples of where a character that was historically Black or definitely not white is played by a white person, right? And that usually, when that's not the case, sometimes they have the Black person and a white person whose role is magnified that it actually was in reality, just so as to make that happen, right? So a lot of people, and I think back in the 60s or 70s, Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra in a movie, and that's another example of that conversation on whitewashing. So people will push back, particularly people from the Afrocentric community, say like, well, why would you have this Egyptian queen played by these white women? Okay, so that's the argument. And I get that given the precedence of whitewashing. However, I believe that it is misguided in that for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we can accept that the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was Greek or Macedonian, took over ancient Egypt towards the end of it, and she was of that bloodline, at best she might have been mixed with African, but she was from that bloodline. So chances of her being Black are close to zero, right? And I don't think that's even the biggest issue right there. So that's why I put her not necessarily as white, because Macedonians are olive skinned, and if she had been mixed, then it may be a little different. However, what I think is more important for me, where I think like people lose me with this debate, is because it plays right into the same Eurocentric narrative that we set out to combat. What do I mean? Well, why the fascination with Cleopatra alone? Well, the reason why we focus so much on Cleopatra alone is because Shakespeare has written about her, and the Western media likes to talk about her, and she's in the story with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and so forth. So now when we choose to fight the Western media on their terms and reclaim this woman who, for all intents and purposes, is of Macedonian descent by record, what we are doing when we engage in that fight is we are saying Cleopatra is the one who matters because you said, as the European media or the Eurocentric media, as Hollywood, that she's the one that matters. So what do we do when we lose that? When we say that? What do we lose when we say that? We lose the fact that I just went through in this lecture 4,000 years of African greatness in ancient Egypt. I've spoken about Nefertiti. I've spoken about King Hatshepsut, who was a female king who established important trade routes. I've spoken about Ramses. I've spoken about Khafra and Djoser and Imhotep for 4,000 years, right? Who are undeniably African, who are undeniably from Kemet originally. Yet we decide to focus on this one queen because Hollywood talks about her. So no, I'm willing to concede that Cleopatra was of Macedonian descent. That takes nothing away from the grandeur of ancient Egypt, because we just went through 4,000, 5,000 years of ancient Egypt. And for a small footnote at the end of it, right, those 300 years of Macedon rule at the end of it, among those people come this Queen Cleopatra. And if we think that changes the narrative of African greatness in ancient Egypt, then we are horribly misguided, and we really need to reconsider how we're pushing back against these racist narratives, right? And I didn't come here to focus so much on that. That's a conversation we can have later. This is supposed to be an intro to African history class, but I hope my thoughts in that case make some sense and they encourage you to engage this topic further. And before I finish that, I found a quote here, and I do apologize because I can't remember exactly where I found it, but it broke it down in a way that I felt like, okay, this is what I've been looking for. It was a question on an Afrocentric site, and again, I do apologize. If anybody knows which one it is, do let me know. In the African American oral tradition, Cleopatra is often said to be an African woman. However, many academics who follow an African-centered approach to Kemet ignore her. This is because Cleopatra's family came to Kemet from Macedonia, right? Her family had lived in Kemet for around 300 years before she was born. Everything I've been saying. Unlike earlier kings of Kemet, the Ptolemies, as they were known, usually took only one official wife but had many mistresses and concubines. These relationships often resulted in children who were illegitimate. Cleopatra and her father were born from such relationships, and it has been suggested to both her mother and grandmother were native to Kemet and so Africans. This is because of the close ties between royal family and the native elite in Kemet, and the fact that the Ptolemies had been in Kemet for so long at this point. Statues of Cleopatra suggest that the queen was part African and the Romans referred to her as Egyptian, not as Greek. So there's very well a chance that within that bloodline, she could be part African, which is great. But what is important is not to lose sight of the forest for the trees as we argue for this one figure as the end all and be all of ancient Egypt, when we have thousands of other years of greatness. By the time Cleopatra came about, the pyramids had been built, hieroglyphics had been established. The biggest religious building in the world had been built, and so forth. So she really is a footnote in that trajectory. And once we start to acknowledge her within that large trajectory, it starts to make sense. Okay, so that's a little bit about my rant about that. But yeah, what are our key takeaways? I'll leave you guys to look over these and spend your time on them. When and why farming develops. Why did the civilizations develop around the Nile? What necessitated the idea of social hierarchies and kingship? What are the defining features of each kingdom? What led to each kingdom's decline? Know about the women's rights. Also important to this, I think, is knowing about the name, right, Kemet, and how it transitioned to Egypt. And with that said, we are done for today. I'll stop sharing here. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this first lecture of the year. It's been great talking to you guys about this. And if you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like it. Make sure you share it with somebody who can share it with somebody who can share it with somebody else. And until next time, I'll see y'all. One.